Okay, welcome to Gears, Bees, and Honey, home of the beekeeping nerd. I'm Carlos, the head nerd, and today we're privileged to be chatting with Chuck Cook, who is in Jacksonville, Florida. He's been keeping bees for how long?
We're at 17 years now.
17 years.
Yeah.
By profession, he's an airline pilot. He's a maker, a doer, invents his own stuff, a man of my own heart. 17 years. How did you get into keeping bees?
So back to the airline story, I was in New York and I was in a crash pad, believe it or not, kind of in between flights, and I was like, I need a new hobby. I have a lot of hobbies, believe me. I've got everything from purple martins to woodworking to, I wasn't into 3D printing at the time, but I had this vague memory of my grandfather having 2 hives. And that was all. He would never let us go near them. We never got to work them, so I didn't get it from doing these, but it was a memory of him doing it. And I just said, I think I want to keep bees. And this was during the CCD time frame when it was in the press a lot, and Save the Bees was a big thing. And I just said, I think I can try to do that. I love working outdoors. As I tell new beekeepers, beekeeping is a little bit more farming than gardening. And I didn't quite know that at the time because I was doing a lot of gardening. I was like, oh, it'll be good for the flowers and things like that. But that's not the reason to get into beekeeping. It's for your own flowers. But that's how it started. It was just an idea. I was not at home, started reading. Obviously, YouTube was an opportunity to learn at this time. And I just started browsing, and there weren't a lot of people covering bees on YouTube at the time, but there was enough to kind of visualize it in your mind's eye and think about it. Oh, I could do that, or I could do that. And it took away the stigma of I can't do that because of the space required or the other things I just didn't know about. So yeah, it was just kind of an idea and a surface level knowledge to get started. And then I came home and discussed it, and then it was find my first set of bees. And I think I found them on Craigslist nearby, and somebody about an hour away sold me a full deep hive full of bees. So I didn't start with a nuclear swarm. I had one deep, and just kind of went from there, and got them through the year, and then splits and starting, and now I don't have a bee problem anymore. I got more bees I don't know what to do with for the space I have anyway. And I'm just a sideliner, or you could even say a home beekeeper. I don't aim to grow outside of the property I am in now.
In a lot of your videos, you talk about catching swarms. It sounds like you catch quite a few.
I do.
What do you do with them?
So, I'm changing what I'm doing with them, but this is a little bit longer story. I keep them, I bring them in my apiary, and they get integrated into my apiary, and also the sales of bees I do for people that want bees. Obviously here in Florida, swarms are something you have to kind of be a little bit worried about with Africanization of bees. Up in Jacksonville, I've never had one, but the state does tell us to be wary of them. I've talked about that on my videos before. Make sure you suit up because you never know what you're going to get when you open up a swarm. But last year, I caught a swarm that ended up harbo testing for, which is one of my most mite-resistant queens, and it was a feral swarm I caught. So now, I'm not giving away any of my swarm queens until after I give them enough time to make some brood and I test them, because believe it or not, I think nature is beating us in Varroa control. The fact that my best queen came from a swarm, now granted, there's no beekeepers around me that are doing anything with regards to Varroa resistant queens, so I don't think it was a swarm from anybody doing it. But we've been treating for so long, and with last year's Amatraz issue with the commercial beekeepers, and we've just been treating. And I've never done anything more than oxalic, but after catching that swarm, and that's when I flipped my switch and said, I think we've been doing it wrong. And I'm also in a position that I don't need to make a living with my bees, so I'm not worried about, I can't let them die because that's my lifeblood. So I recognize that most commercial beekeepers can't let the bees die by not treating. So that's just a worse thing there. So that's what I do with them. I bring them in, but now I'm keeping them and I'm testing them. I'm gonna see if they integrate into the genetics of my apiary. And also because I'm doing instrumental insemination now, I just took the training last couple weeks ago. Bringing in swarms also introduces that genetic diversity that I can't have because I'm below the scientific recommended limit of 100 hives, right? They say to have an actual breeding program, you need to have 100 hives. I have about half of that as far as breeding queens. So bringing in swarms also adds to that diversity when I find a good queen that isn't from my own apiary. kind of a long answer, but that's what I'm doing now.
That's the answer I wanted.
Yeah.
What is about beekeeping that you find the most fulfilling?
Beekeeping scratches a lot of itches. It sounds like for you too that fit me. It's a woodworking opportunity, right? I'm not a furniture woodworker, but I've got the tools, and I still got all of my digits, so I haven't made any drastic mistakes yet. But I love pulling out the dado blade or the router bit or the table saw or the chop saw and building something like what we have right behind me here, that Queen Castle I built last week. It's just, you get an idea, you don't necessarily need to go to the catalog and order one, right? You want to build something, you can experiment with it. Earlier, Carlos, you and I were talking about the mini mating nukes and how I've gone to a wooden version of that. Now granted, there's some construction going on behind you here. I've got a little bit of extra wood now too, so it's not like I'm going to the hardware store to buy that wood. I'm kind of going to the scrap pile over there and pulling out some of the lumber and using that.
A lot of apartments being built near me.
Yeah,
And I've made good use of their scrap pile.
Yeah, finding a nice piece of plywood that's usable for a bottom or a lid or a divider board or something like that is it's fun. So A1, it scratches the woodworking itch. As you do, I enjoy 3D printing. I enjoy, more than printing, I enjoy designing. The CAD part, the computer-aided design part of 3D printing. And once you understand how to design something in 3D, all it takes is an idea. And prototyping is fun for me. While some people may think it's hard or confusing, it also scratches that design building maker, as you said, itch of mine to make something new and then prototype it like you have with your hive and other things and just keep on iterating.
I know I'll wake up in the morning with an idea.
Yeah.
And I've got to go sit down at the CAD software.
Right. You got to write it down.
Write it down, writing it down in CAD.
And I'm also a computer programmer, so not by trade, but by skill. And I love writing software. I love using computer interfaces, APIs. On all of my hives over here, I've got broodminder hives, scales, I've got temperature sensors, I've got all sorts of data coming out of my hives. And I really love writing a program that does something with the data that broodminder isn't doing, or a swarm watch or a temperature watch. Or for example, the observation hive you saw in there, I put a little Yolink temperature sensor right next to that I can monitor the temperature. And then I was like, but if it gets below 40 degrees, I want to turn on the heater. So I'll write a computer program that watches the temperature. And when the temperature gets below a certain amount, then it'll turn the heater on. And then if it gets above this, it turns the heater off. Just little things like that make me happy. That is
sounds wonderful.
Overcomplicated, overkill, and there's probably something on the internet I could go buy to do it all, but I enjoy doing it myself rather than buying it. So, and then there's the bees and the honey, and I didn't know this when I got into it, but when you're married and you have a family, having a hobby that is self-sustaining, it brings in a little bit of money. It makes it a little bit easier to sell that hobby. You're not out there, spending more money than you're bringing in necessarily, just perhaps denting the family income or the budget for that month. So it's a little easier to rationalize going to spend something on a new saw or a new printer or a new whatever, because there's income that I'm taking. Maybe I'm net profit on the honey and the bees and the queens and everything, but not much, because I reinvest a lot of it into tools and camera equipment like you have and other things like that.
All right. So what is about beekeeping that is your least fulfilling thing?
Probably the farming part of it, that you can't just stop. You can't take a break, meaning you can't let your bees get sick, you can't let your bees get hungry, you can't miss a queen rearing cycle. There are certain days involved, and you have to time it right. It's not a set it and forget it hobby. You're not putting 2 hives in the garden and walking away and just observing it and watching it the entire time. That's probably my least favorite, because I do have time constraints with my work, and sometimes I have to really, really juggle that a little bit. I have to graft. Like, for example, I've got a graft tomorrow, which means I got to make the cell builder today so that the queens hatch on the day that I'm home, so that they're not going to die in the cells and coming out and give them water. So that part of it is probably the most difficult for me to manage because of my schedule and my line of work. And it's hard work too. You know, you get out in the heat of the summer here in Florida. You know, you're in a little cooler climate, but you do have warm summers. You know, it's hot and sweaty, and you can't take that day off. You know,
you have the humidity that
yeah,
I don't have.
Right. You can't take that day off. You've got to get out there and you got to do your mite checks. You've got to do the chores that are required to do it right. That's probably my least favorite, but you know, when it's done, you still get the satisfaction that it was done. And just like I imagine anyone working in land or animals feel at the end of the day. So,
you mentioned family. How has your family been involved?
Other than enjoying the honey, not at all. So my kids, when they were younger, got exposed to it, but they didn't like getting stung. They didn't really want to help. There was a period when I would yank them into the honey extraction process, and we kind of team up on the cutting the comb and then the spinning and things like that before I got my first extractor. And then other than that, my wife does help me refill the jars and keep because I don't sell at any sort of markets or anything like that. I just have a stand on my front porch. I have an honor system out front with a little bit of a money box, and I got some Venmo and Cash App links to pay me. People just come up and get honey and take it. My wife does help me refill those jars when I'm out of town, so that we got a good supply out front and things like that. But that's about it. Yeah, this is my hobby, not necessarily theirs. So they tolerate the bees. They don't have their own bee suits or anything like that, though. Yeah.
What advice would you have for somebody who's just getting started?
Like I think I said earlier, you got to realize that beekeeping is more farming than gardening. So just know that going in. You're taking care of an animal. It is husbandry. There are responsibilities involved. It is not a garden ornament. It's not anything to just set it and look at and think you're contributing to the pollination in your area. That's not what beekeeping is. Beekeeping is a little bit more like owning chickens that get sick, that need antibiotics, that need care and protection, you know, with a pen and things like that. Those are the things to think about before you get into beekeeping. You know, the initial investment is not extremely high, but it's not zero. You know, you need some woodenware, you need some tools, you need a jacket, you need a smoker, you need some things. So don't go buy bees before you've done the homework on the tools that you're going to need in order to be prepared to do the work that is involved. When beekeepers, you know, call me or say, "Hey, I'm ready to get some bees," I say, "Well, do you have your jacket, and your smoker, and your hive tool, and a place to put them at a minimum?" And what they really think they're going to do is just pick up a box and set it in the ground and watch them. And I usually shy them away and won't sell the bees if that's where they are. So those are the things to think about.
Like a pet turtle.
Yeah, well, exactly. You know, who's going to clean the turtle tank? And who's going to buy the food? And, yes.
Big difference between being a bee haver and a beekeeper.
Yes. I do also, one of the recommendations I make is I try to always recommend a minimum of 2 hives. I started with 1, and I realized that was a mistake early on, because when you have a sick hive, if you've only got 1, you don't know it. If you've got a weak hive, you don't know why, or even how weak it is. Whereas if you have 2 hives, even if it's just 2 5-frame nucleus colonies, you can observe, wow, there's a lot of bees coming and going from that one, but there's only 1 or 2 coming and going from that one. You have something to compare against. And as you get further into beekeeping, you also learn you can share resources, you can support one with the other. If you lose a queen, you've got eggs in the other. You can do. There's so many tools that having a minimum of 2 laying queen hives gives a new beekeeper to be successful. While the investment's a little bit higher to start off with 2 hives, I think your overall success will be higher having those 2 queens laying to get you through. Both learning what a strong hive looks like, watching the queen, and the backup of an extra queen still laying eggs to keep you going.
Now this is a hard question. What advice would you have for somebody who's been keeping bees for 30 or 40 years?
That's actually not a hard problem for me at all, because if you've been keeping bees that long, you're not using the resources most likely that are available to you today to learn from other beekeepers. Most people that have been keeping bees for that long are stuck in their ways. They have their stuff, their techniques that are tried and true, and they work for them. But what they probably aren't utilizing are resources and tools that we have available today that make beekeeping a lot more fun, or B, a lot more successful with regards to things like scales, Now, granted, there's investment and there's money involved in some of these tools and things like that. I think YouTube, my parents, are of the age that they could, if they kept bees, and they know how to use YouTube, but I don't know that everyone does. And I'm not saying everything on YouTube is good, but just like you teach your children to be social media smart, to take information in, but realize what's garbage and it's not, take it in as a data point, not as gospel. You do have to have those skills when you use social media or any sort of online source as a reference. But I think you can assimilate information so much quicker using tools like AI. I can't tell you how many times for my master craftsman project I've used the AI large language models such as ChatGPT, Grok, or Anthropic to help me write my paper, to gather resources of documented information and to correlate that information into usable resources that I can cite, and it just assimilates information better. It's like having a PhD right next to you when you're doing research. I would guarantee you there's not many 40-year-old beekeepers using large language models in their beekeeping for assimilating new information or digesting papers. There's a lot of good papers being written by the USDA, Frank Rickenbeck and others, but they're written in a language that beekeepers typically don't know how to digest. If you take that paper and you put it in a large language model and say, what can this do for me in southern Florida or northern Florida or Utah, it will digest that information for you and give you something usable. I think those are things that the new beekeepers can use.
Now, you mentioned your your mating notes. About how many queens do you raise a year?
Let's see, I'm on my 5th graft of 45 now. That doesn't mean I have that many queens. Obviously, there's successful grafts. There's queens that I pinch because they're too small, or they didn't get fed right, or the cups don't hatch, or they hatch in the incubator before I get home from work and the queens don't make it without getting water. So I take about half of those down to successfully hatched, and then of those, about 75% come back mated in my area. I don't know if you've heard them over your right shoulder, but I have got a super colony of purple martins right here, and there is nothing those birds love to eat more than dragonflies and honeybees. So it's sort of like a gauntlet that my queens have to go through to successfully get mated here, which may add to the success of the bees that do come back as they're the surviving stock. At any one time, I probably go through, let's say it's hundreds, not thousands of queens a year, and then I use those for breeding stock, culling, I don't sell hundreds of queens. I sell probably dozens of queens a year.
Yeah. In your videos, you talked about doing herbo assays and stuff. What made you decide to use that method of evaluation?
Data. Having another data point to add to the mite wash. And I'm also starting to think about incorporating the pin-kill brood test for a hygienic test. It's not a Varroa test, but it's a hygienic test. Watching others, grabbing data points, and it's not the be-all, end-all. It does take some time. While they say the Harbo assay is one queen is a Harbo whatever for her entire life, I'm not sure I am in complete agreement with that yet. And it may be because of my testing environment. The Varroa pressure is an important part of the Harbo assay. You have to have enough mites to make sure they're actually fighting mites versus just a low Varroa period. So I think multiple Harbos is important. And other than general gut feel of queens you like, you need something to select against. Temperament is a difficult thing to measure because one day they're happy and the next day they're not. So the only way I think I can accurately keep temperament is to actually mark the hot ones, and multiple hot bees over and over and over ultimately get culled. But one bad day doesn't mean it's a bad queen. It could be a dearth, it could be a pheromone issue, it could be the weather, it could be the clouds, it could be so many other things. Whereas Harbo, at least I know I've taken 200 to 500 cells out of their brood, and I know how the reproductive situation of the mites are. And also doing all these Harbos, I'm starting to learn what amount of bald brood represents hygienics, and I'm like, if I see a lot of bald brood, I have another visual cue that I've learned through doing the Harbo assays of that's what they're doing. They're pulling brood. So I guess the data point is probably the best thing. It's not the gospel. But it's the best thing that we've got going right now. Now there is UBO, and there's some other tools that Kara's come out with that we can buy to do tests against we hopefully it's varroa sensitive hygiene, but they're not completely overlapping yet. But it is helping fight, they think, the deformed wing virus and the other things in the hive. So I could add UBO eventually, but I just haven't taken that step yet. The hardest problem about Harbo is all these queens I've got, and like a swarm like I caught last weekend, I've got to give them 7 weeks to lay enough brood for that brood to hatch and for the turnover of that brood to represent the progeny of that queen, so then I can test it against a Harbo. So all of these queens over here in the mini mating groups aren't going to get 7 weeks to get Harboed, right? So somehow you've got to have a selection criteria to get them in some hives to ultimately determine next year's out of all of these. So generally these are all daughters of Harbos. So I'm probably going to take size, color maybe, if you want to keep a dark bee, a light bee. A couple of them hatched that almost look Carniolan, kind of redheaded, and I'm like, where did you come from? But when you get a string of a bee that comes out and it catches your eye, that's another reason.
I do like my queens that are different colored than their daughters.
Yeah,
because they're easier to spot.
They are.
I'm not good at spotting.
I love a good dark bee if it doesn't have genetics of any sort of other problem, just because it's different. They're harder. Dark ones are not easy to see necessarily, but they're different. Yeah, so that was a long answer to the Harbo, and I was thinking through how to try to describe it. Isn't the be all end all, but it's just another tool that I'm adding. And I'll also add, I've started to learn that with my mite checks, with no treatments, if I get a 25 or 30 mite, I know what that Harbo is going to do. It's going to be a Harbo 0. But if I get a 7 or a 10, it could be a Harbo 3, it could be a Harbo 4, depending on the mite pressure that time of year. Harbo 4 queens don't have 0 mites, which goes into what's Randy Oliver growing. He's growing something that has 0 mites. And so what is he finding? Is he got mite biters in there? Has he got varroa sensitive in there? Has he got ultra hygienic bees in there? Or is it something else?
The interesting thing is he doesn't care.
He doesn't care. He abstracts that layer up to, I don't care what they're doing, I'm just breeding for that metric of 0 mites. I do think
not hot and low mites.
Yeah, they really are. And I think that's a good way of doing it. I don't have any 0 mite queens to breed from, so I'm looking for something to breed. I don't know that it's fair to say in my climate I can expect to have what he has. And that's one of the downsides of the internet, is you start comparing yourself against people that you just can't compare yourself against. You were saying you don't even have small hive beetles, and I showed you my observational hive. There's a tray of dead beetles in there. These are things we deal with here. The reason I started my YouTube channel was because nobody was providing content in my area. And I said, well, why not me be the guy to provide a little bit? Hyper local, beekeeping is local. And we can learn ideas from each other, but you ultimately got to adapt to your climate.
Figure out what you can apply and what you can pick up for.
Yeah.
You mentioned YouTube. Are there providers that you follow?
I follow everybody on YouTube, except for the clickbaity kind of. I get turned off by people selling things. So if it turns into an ad or a sales pitch for something, I typically don't want very long into that. Because I'm more advanced, I'm not looking for beginner content anymore. So perhaps there are those focusing on very basic stuff. I find I don't have much tolerance for the Instagram, TikTok-y 1-minute videos showing something, because that's people just kind of getting clicks for. I look for deeper content, thoughtful. Maker type of content, ideas that perhaps are a little out of the ordinary to think through. Long form, I prefer a 20 to 30 minute video versus a 5-minute video. Sometimes I'm entertained by things I don't do, like cutouts and stuff like that. If you end up on Randy McCaffrey's channel, the Dirt Rooster or something like that, sometimes it's just entertaining watching that big guy get those bees out of the wall, and it's entertaining. Yeah, so I think for YouTube content, You know, Bob Benny, I respect him. He's got a lot of experience and information, but I feel like I've got his beekeeping thing down. So if there's a new Bob video and I don't have to watch it, I feel like I've watched 5-8 seasons of him now, and I know his the way he thinks. I like to see him do studies. I like to see him work at the University of Georgia and run a trial on something and things like that. I am interested in.
His study of the extended release that he did this last
Yes,
year.
that sort of content is amazing. And I think it's great that the universities and people are using his hives as a resource because he has such a good audience and demeanor and a way, humbleness about him. He's easy to watch, for sure.
It's like watching Kenny Rogers.
It is. He does have that look to him. He does a little, and he takes care of his people, and he's building a business, and he's been thoughtful about the people that work for him. And I do think that he's done well in this part of the country, really building a bee business and being successful. I hope he is able one day to sell that business to somebody that cares about bees as much as he does, not just trying to make a buck.
What stuff we haven't talked about would you like to share with the world of beekeeping?
What would I like to share? If you're passionate about anything, especially beekeeping, keep digging is what I would say. You know, try different things. Don't let the constraints of your life, your land, your whatever get in your way. Find a way around it. You know, I think that once you get beyond 2 or 3 hives, you need to give yourself 5 years to consider yourself have gone through everything. You're a dumber beekeeper. You have more questions about beekeeping, I think, when you die than when you start. It seems like it's going that way. Well, I've chosen to go down the academic route with the Master Beekeeper program and the Master Craftsman program here in the state of Florida. It's kind of like going back to college, and I'm more of an academic in that way. I don't think people need to feel they need to do that. There's lots of ways of getting trained and educated without getting a certification. But if you're interested in the certification or working with the universities, it's another great avenue to get involved. Not everybody can have a mentor, and mentors are hard to find that will give you their time that you need as a beginner. So a lot of times, you know, social media will end up being your mentor if you're new, and that's okay, but recognize it's not a substitute for asking good questions. So I would say bee clubs and places where you can solicit, or getting somebody that doesn't mind replying to a text here and there. But recognize most people that are mentoring or offering to answer questions have their lives and the businesses and the other things they're doing, and they're not necessarily there just for you, unless it's part of a program like Hives for Heroes or other these mentorship programs that are actually dedicating and assigning mentors for a certain period of time, and it's a commitment that someone's given. I do sometimes find myself answering a lot of questions where I'm kind of like, well, I made a video about that, and I use the videos to answer questions rather than, you know, when you're on social media, a lot of times people feel like they know you because you become friends of them, and that's fine. But recognize if you just start texting them or emailing them or things like that and asking questions, the number of those that they might get in their position.
Yeah, there might be 3,000 people.
Yeah,
do the same
you know,
thing.
so, and I try to be as polite and helpful as I can, but at the same time, I might be in the air at 37,000 feet, and I just can't get to your question right now, you know. I'm not sitting here waiting by the phone to answer everybody's questions. But I want to be as helpful as I can, and I try to put content out, and a lot of times I'll make subject matter out of the questions that I've gotten that I think are worth covering. Sometimes people give me ideas, and the comments of YouTubers is a great place for that, because I do try to answer every single comment. But it's just because everybody needs a mentor. I don't want to discourage that, but I'll say they're hard to find unless they're a personal friend or a relative.
It's probably a good idea to get somebody local to you who can.
Yeah, absolutely.
If they need to come take a look. Rather than somebody
And I look back at when I was new, the number of questions I sent to the local beekeepers, and I can only imagine, you know, how I came across to them at that time too. But you know, you live and you learn, and it is part of it.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to talk with a stranger from 2,000 miles away.
Well, thank you for driving up. It was very nice, and also taking the time to film and ask some questions. It's good. You've got a lot of great ideas, and I enjoy watching your maker parts.
My wife and my grandson were talking, and my wife said that the bees are Grandpa's passion, and my grandson said no, it's his obsession.
That's a
Yeah,
good one.
it absolutely is.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Chuck.
Absolutely,
Appreciate
Carlos.
it.
Enjoyed it.